Picture yourself sitting at a closing table while the loan officer slides a sheet across toward you. A $400,000 house, $80,000 down, money it took you 6 years to save, leaving $320,000 borrowed. And the figure at the bottom, the one you're on the hook for every month for the next 30 years, reads $2,129. Your sister Priya bought the exact same floor plan 2 streets over back in 2021. Same price, same down payment, same loan amount. Her payment comes to $1,349. That's $780 a month, separating you and your own sister on the same house. Nothing about the house itself changed. What changed was a single decimal point on a government webpage neither of you has ever bothered to look at. I'm Nick. Today, I want to show you why the entire planet is buried in debt, why that decimal point might be the single most expensive number in your life, and one more thing worth sticking around for. By the end, you'll understand why you, the one paying more, might actually end up ahead. Let's start with what that gap is really costing you, because you should know your own number before we go anywhere near a trillion of anything. Trillion is the point where numbers stop behaving like money and start behaving like weather. Over the full life of the loan, Priya ends up paying roughly $165,000 in interest. You end up paying around $446,000. That's a $280,000 gap. Same house, same family, same down payment. You didn't overpay. You didn't negotiate poorly. You're simply renting money during a year when money got expensive, while she rented it back when it was almost free. She didn't out-negotiate you. She out-timed you by 24 months, which isn't really a skill, and I'd encourage you to bring that up at every family gathering you're invited to from now on. This goes way beyond your kitchen table because the exact same thing happened every government on the planet at roughly the same time. The world collectively owes somewhere around $348 trillion. Governments account for roughly $107 trillion of that. Companies owe about $100 trillion. Banks owe $76 trillion. And households, meaning you, Priya, and everyone you've ever stood behind in a checkout line, owe somewhere near $65 trillion. Split that across 8 billion people and it works out to about $43,000 per person, newborns included, which is a rough way to arrive into the world. Here's what a trillion actually is. Count out $1 every second, and $1 million takes 11 days. A billion takes 31 years. A trillion takes 31,700 years. You'd have started counting before agriculture was even invented. Now multiply that by 348. Hold that number loosely, though, because serious institutions place the global total anywhere between 250 trillion and 348 trillion, depending on what they choose to count. When the experts themselves disagree by $100 trillion, you're not looking at a precise measurement. You're looking at an educated guess wearing a suit. Here's the part nobody puts in a thumbnail. Measured against the size of the global economy, worldwide debt has actually shrunk for 5 straight years running. The record-breaking total dollar figure and the shrinking overall burden are both simultaneously true, which tells you the thing crushing you isn't really the size of the pile. So if the pile isn't growing faster than the economy underneath it, why does life feel like it's closing in on you? Because the interest rate on the pile changed. That's essentially the entire video, and you and Priya are each living inside one half of that story. To understand why that matters, you need to grasp something genuinely strange about where money actually comes from. And I promise this isn't the part where I tell you to go buy gold. Back in 2014, the Bank of England published something remarkable. When a bank issues you a loan, it isn't handing you cash that somebody else deposited somewhere. It's typing a brand new deposit directly into your account. Your loan literally creates the money, and roughly 97% of what you think of as money isn't physical cash at all. It's bank deposits, which is really just somebody else's debt viewed from the opposite side of the ledger. To be fair and not insult your intelligence, banks can't conjure money endlessly out of thin air. They're constrained by capital requirements, by interest rates, and by the basic problem of finding borrowers who can actually repay them. But the core fact still holds. In the economy you live inside of, your money and your debt are literally the same substance, just viewed from opposite ends, which means that $780 a month is heading somewhere specific. Let's find out who's actually receiving it. His name is Hector. He's 67 years old, and he's a big part of why your payment looks the way it does. He spent 40 years quietly parking his money in safe, boring places. And for most of the past decade, he was punished for doing exactly that. His savings account paid him 0.4% on $50,000. That works out to $200 a year, enough for one nice dinner and a tip. Every single month, his bank mailed him what was functionally a receipt confirming he'd earned almost nothing. Today, Hector's cash earns closer to 5%. Same account, same man, 12 times the income, and you happen to be one of the people footing that bill. Sit with that for a second, because your entire financial life is downstream of it. Every single dollar of debt on the planet is somebody else's asset. There's no such thing as debt existing without a creditor on the other side of it. When your payment leaves your account, it doesn't vanish into some void. It travels toward Hector, toward pension funds, toward people you will genuinely never meet in your lifetime. The world isn't drowning. It's simply split between those who owe money and those who are owed it, and the terms between those two groups just got quietly rewritten while you were busy living your life. So why borrow the money at all instead of just taxing you directly or printing it outright? There are legitimate reasons. Wars arrive suddenly. Recessions need somebody spending money when everyone like you has stopped spending. But mostly, taxing you directly is politically unpopular. Printing robs you slowly through inflation, and borrowing manages to do neither of those things today. Instead, it quietly pushes the actual cost onto a future version of you who can't vote yet. Which is exactly how America ended up carrying roughly $39.5 trillion in federal debt, close to 99% of the entire national economy, on pace to break the record set right after World War II. Per American citizen, that works out to about $116,000, a completely different measurement from the $43,000 figure I mentioned earlier. One is strictly federal debt. The other is all debt on Earth combined. Anyone quoting both figures in the same breath isn't doing math, they're putting on a performance. But the total dollar amount was never really the problem. Here's the actual problem, and it's essentially the same problem you're personally living through. Last year, America spent roughly $970 billion purely on interest payments. Not roads, not soldiers, not hospitals, not one single tangible thing you could ever physically walk into. $970 billion simply for the privilege of having borrowed money in the past. That's the third largest line item in the entire federal budget. Only retirement programs and healthcare cost the government more. It's larger than the entire defense budget combined. It swallows roughly 19% of every single dollar the government collects from you, working out to about $7,300 per household every year. That's $2.8 billion a day. In the time you've spent watching this video so far, that bill has grown by roughly $35 million. 5 years ago, that annual figure sat at $345 billion. It's very nearly tripled, and the underlying debt itself did not triple. Here's the actual mechanism behind it, and once you see it, you genuinely can't unsee it. Government debt isn't a 30-year fixed mortgage the way yours is. It matures constantly and has to be continuously replaced. Last year alone, about $9 trillion of it came due for refinancing. A full quarter of the entire national debt got refinanced within a single year. So picture the government shuffling up to the refinancing window month after month, handing back bonds that were originally issued at 1.5% interest and walking away instead with brand new ones at 4%, over and over again. It's essentially someone rolling one credit card balance onto another, except the credit limit here is $9 trillion, and the teller processing it is the entire planet. It's your exact same problem, just with 8 extra zeros attached and zero option to simply stay put in the old house. I want to pause here because I suspect you already know exactly what this section feels like from the inside. It feels like refreshing a mortgage rate website every single morning, the same way other people check the weather forecast. It feels like finally landing the raise you spent 2 years working toward, only to watch every dollar of it disappear into a payment that didn't even exist when you first started that job. It feels like scribbling refinance math on the back of an envelope for a rate that may genuinely never return, and then doing that same math again the following week anyway. It feels like the phrase starter home quietly turning into a joke you no longer find funny. And it feels like sitting across from Priya at Thanksgiving while she casually mentions when exactly she bought her place, unable to fully explain why that one sentence sits so heavily in your chest 3 weeks before your own closing date. You almost walked away from the deal entirely. You had the email to your agent fully drafted. You never sent it. Hold on to that moment, because the real reason you were right not to send it isn't the reason you probably assume. Here's what I actually need you to hear. You didn't miss some window of opportunity because you were lazy or slow or somehow bad at this. There was no window to miss in the first place. What happened was a global repricing event, decided collectively by inflation data, central bank committees, and bond markets spread across 4 continents. Nobody consulted you about any of it. Nobody consulted Priya either. She didn't outsmart you in any meaningful sense. She simply happened to be standing in a different calendar year. The only real difference between the two of you is which price you each happen to get handed. You're not behind in life, you're paying full retail price for something your own sister happened to catch on sale, and that sale was never actually advertised anywhere. Quick pause here because the next section gets a little strange. I run a community where we break down exactly how to build income streams that don't depend on any of this stuff, including how to grow a faceless YouTube channel from literally 0 subscribers. Links below if you're curious. It costs nothing to join, and I personally answer questions in there. All right, back to it. Now let's take down the single most popular myth you've probably been told your whole life, that America owes all of this money to China specifically. Foreign holders collectively own about 24% of it. The remaining 76% is owed to American pension funds, American banks, and the very retirement trust fund that's supposed to eventually pay you back later in life. And the single largest foreign holder isn't even China, it's actually Japan. China currently holds under 2% of the total, its lowest share since 2008, and it's been quietly selling off its holdings for years now. So the honest answer to who you actually owe this money to is mostly Hector, people just like him, and quite possibly your own retirement account. Which means the honest answer to who's really doing this to us is, at least partly, ourselves. That's either deeply reassuring or it's Thanksgiving dinner with Priya happening all over again, entirely depending on your particular family. At this point, you're probably waiting for me to announce that some kind of collapse is coming. I'm not going to, because one country has been living your exact nightmare scenario for 30 straight years and simply refuses to fall apart. Japan's government debt sits around 230% of its entire economy, a number far higher than anything you've ever been warned about. And it's basically sat right there since the 1990s. Traders predicted its inevitable collapse for so long that betting against Japanese government bonds actually earned its own nickname. They call it the Widowmaker trade, because it tends to financially destroy anyone who tries it. So why exactly is Japan doing fine? Because the overwhelming majority of that debt is owned domestically. Its own central bank holds something like 46% of every single government bond issued in the entire country. When your biggest buyer is essentially your own central bank, nobody panics and starts a fire sale. And because interest rates stayed near 0 for so long, Japan's debt servicing costs ran at roughly 1.7% of its economy, compared to 3 or 4% for America. Japan owed dramatically more money and paid dramatically less to service it, which should tell you everything you need to know. The total size was never really the story. The interest rate was always the actual story. Now here comes the twist. Japan officially ended its negative interest rate policy in 2024, and its long-term bond yields have been steadily climbing ever since. Your own closing table and Japan's bond market are quietly running the exact same script in parallel. And while we're busy demolishing popular myths, here's arguably the most expensive spreadsheet error in modern history. Back in 2010, 2 well-known economists published an influential paper claiming that once a country's debt crosses 90% of its economy, economic growth essentially falls off a cliff. It quickly became something close to gospel. Finance ministers around the world quoted it directly. Austerity budgets were built leaning heavily on its conclusions, meaning it eventually reached directly into real pension checks and real hospital budgets. Then a graduate student asked to see the original underlying spreadsheet because he simply couldn't reproduce their published results. He finally got access to it, and it turned out a formula had been accidentally dragged across the wrong range of cells, silently excluding 5 entire countries from the calculated average. Once properly corrected, that supposed cliff completely disappeared. Growth for heavily indebted countries actually came out closer to 2.2%, not negative territory at all. There's still a genuine, real correlation between heavy debt loads and somewhat slower growth. And to their credit, the original authors always described it as correlation rather than causation. But an entire decade of policy that reshaped millions of real lives leaned heavily on a formula that simply stopped one row too early. Next time you feel bad about a small mistake at work, carry that story around with you like a warm little stone in your pocket. So what actually happens when this whole system does go wrong? Because sometimes it genuinely does. What transforms an ordinary debt problem into a full-blown crisis is losing the market's confidence faster than you're able to respond to it. Back in 2022, Britain announced a large package of unfunded tax cuts. Bond yields immediately spiked. Pension funds were forced to start selling off the very same bonds that were actively crashing in value, which pushed yields even higher, which then triggered even more forced selling. The central bank was forced to step in within 5 days. The prime minister was gone within 7. A bond market effectively disciplined an entire national government faster than most people managed to cancel a gym membership. And then there's what it looks like when absolutely nobody steps in to help. Back in 2022, Sri Lanka defaulted on its debt for the very first time in its national history. 12-hour rolling blackouts followed. Fuel lines stretched for kilometers down the road. Hospitals ran completely out of basic medicine. At least 12 people died simply waiting in those fuel lines, ranging in age from 19 to 84 years old. The president ultimately fled the country entirely. So the next time you hear the phrase sovereign debt crisis tossed around casually, stop picturing some abstract chart on a screen. Picture an 84-year-old man dying while standing in line for cooking gas. Alright, at this point you understand roughly how large the problem is, why it suddenly got so expensive, and what happens when the whole system actually breaks down. The only remaining question is how it eventually gets resolved. Historically speaking, there are really only 5 ways out of this kind of situation. Exit number 1 is simply growing your way out of it, and this is exactly where the popular version of the story starts falling apart. Everyone assumes that American debt fell from around 106% of the economy right after the war down to roughly 23% by the 1970s, purely because of booming economic growth. Researchers eventually went back and rebuilt that entire period from scratch. Growth alone would have only brought that figure down to about 73%, not all the way to 23%. So growth only did about half the work everyone's been crediting it for, which makes we'll simply grow our way out of this about as reliable a plan as we'll figure it out later. So what accounted for the rest of it? Exit number 2 is inflation, along with its quieter cousin, financial repression, which honestly sounds like something you'd bring up with a therapist, and maybe you genuinely should. For roughly 35 years following the war, real interest rates were actually negative about half the time, quietly wiping out somewhere between 3 and 4% of the total debt burden every single year. Nobody ever voted on this happening. Nobody officially announced it either. Bondholders were technically paid back in full, just in money that was worth considerably less than what they'd originally lent out, and most of them never fully worked out exactly what had happened to their savings. Exit number 3 is austerity, which mostly ends up failing because shrinking the overall economy also shrinks the very denominator you're measuring the debt against. Exit number 4 is outright default, which simply isn't available to any country that borrows money in its own domestic currency. Exit number 5 is letting the central bank quietly absorb the debt itself, essentially a slightly better dressed version of exit number 2. So the realistic answer for your own country really isn't much in doubt. It's not outright default. It's some combination of modest economic growth, persistent inflation, and savers quietly getting paid less than they probably deserve for a very long stretch of time. Which means the bill absolutely does get paid eventually. It just ends up getting paid primarily by people like Hector. And now I can finally circle back and answer the question I opened with, and explain that email you ultimately never sent. The interest rate the government itself pays essentially functions as the floor underneath the entire cost of money throughout your financial life. Your mortgage rate gets priced directly off of it. Your car loan stacks additional cost right on top, currently averaging north of 7% for new vehicles. Your credit card, assuming you carry any kind of balance, sits somewhere above 22%, which honestly deserves its own separate video and, frankly, its own separate emotional support animal. Every single one of those numbers is fundamentally the government's own borrowing rate, plus some additional markup reflecting the risk that you, specifically, are not the federal government. So that $970 billion interest bill isn't just some distant political news story happening somewhere else. It's the exact same repricing event that put $780 a month of daylight between you and your own sister. You're not merely adjacent to this story. You're living directly inside of it. But look carefully at where that actually leaves you standing. You just locked in a fixed monthly payment inside a world whose most likely long-term resolution involves decades of ongoing inflation. Your payment itself literally cannot rise from here. Meanwhile, the actual dollars you use to make that payment will almost certainly keep losing value with every passing year. Priya locked in the better rate, and she's doing perfectly fine, but she's not exactly positioned to be the one the next 30 years are structurally built to reward. Hector is, and unfortunately not in a particularly good way, because the historical exit route out of debt, this enormous runs directly through people who are simply sitting on cash. That's precisely why you were right not to send that email. Not because the house itself was some incredible bargain, because it genuinely wasn't, but because you accidentally landed on the exact side of the ledger that inflation tends to quietly forgive. Some perspective is worth adding here, though, because doom framing is honestly just lazy storytelling. American households collectively owe a record $18.8 trillion, but the actual share of household income going toward debt payments is currently sitting below where it stood right before the 2008 financial crash, mostly because so many people managed to lock in cheap mortgage rates and simply never let go of them. The real concern is the savings rate, hovering near 2.6% against a pre-pandemic norm that was closer to 7%. And remember, these are all averages, not medians. The typical household's actual situation looks nothing like the raw arithmetic suggests. The pain here is heavily concentrated, not evenly shared across everyone. So here's what I'd genuinely do with all of this information. Stop sitting around waiting for 3% rates to magically come back. They might eventually return. But building your entire life plan around the reversal of a global repricing event isn't really a strategy at all. It's just hope with a spreadsheet attached to it. Instead, treat today's risk-free rate as your personal hurdle to clear. If government debt itself is currently paying out 4 or 5% with essentially zero risk, then any investment, renovation project, or business idea you're considering needs to beat that number after taxes before it even deserves your money. That kind of discipline simply didn't exist for the better part of a decade, and it's genuinely the one useful thing this whole mess has actually handed you. And know exactly which side of the ledger you personally sit on, because that single fact decides basically everything else. If your own debt is fixed and your income has room to grow, time is actively working in your favor. If your savings are sitting entirely in cash, time is working directly against you. Hector needs to hear that message far more urgently than you do. I'm not a financial advisor, and none of this should be taken as financial advice. It's simply arithmetic, and arithmetic doesn't care about your personal situation. If you want access to the community where we work through all of this together in more depth, the link is below. One last thing before we go. America has fully paid off its entire national debt exactly once in its history, back in 1835. 2 years later, the country collapsed into one of the worst economic depressions of that entire century, partly because eliminating the debt entirely also removed the safe underlying asset the whole financial system had been built around. Turns out the plumbing itself was load-bearing all along. The world isn't drowning in debt because people suddenly got greedy. The world is in debt because debt itself is the plumbing running underneath everything. And for about 15 years, your water ran essentially free. It isn't free anymore. Nobody ever sent you an official notice about it. The rate simply changed, and everything built on top of that rate, including the number printed on the sheet sitting in front of you right now, changed right along with it. You're not bad with money. The price of money itself simply moved while you were busy living your life. So go find out what your actual rate really is and then make absolutely sure that everything you own is earning more than that number, not less.